The story of the Gospel of Matthew is the first gospel in the New Testament. It's the first book of the New Testament. The story of the Gospel of Matthew tells the story of Jesus from the time that he was born, even before that time, until the time that he rose again. The author was a person, probably the Apostle Matthew, also referred to as Levi. He was of the tribe of Levi. We understand he was a tax collector who was called by Christ out of that profession into being his disciple. Could have been written anywhere from around 40 AD, 40 to about 80, 70, but probably toward the end of the 60s, and there's different reasons to think that that could have been the case. Some would suggest a later date, but this is a very likely date. We don't know where it was written from, but a good candidate probably is Antioch, or perhaps Palestine, but Antioch of Syria is probably a good case. The outline of the book you'll see in the PowerPoint that's with us today is that there's first 4 chapters deal with the birth and preparation for ministry of Jesus. Chapters 4 through 16 speak about his public ministry that takes place in Galilee and the northern regions. Chapters 16 through 18 speak about his private ministry in Galilee, so it's no longer his public ministry, but now a private one in the same region. And then beginning in verse 19, it switches ministry focus to Judea. The capital of that region was Jerusalem. And so 19 through 25 are his ministries in Judea. And then chapters 26, 27, and 28 represent his passion and then his resurrection. And the term passion is often used to refer to the week in which he was executed, and his trial, and the Lord's Supper, and all of those events that took place at that particular time. And so that's the general outline for Matthew. There are several key themes in Matthew. One of them is the fulfillment formula. Matthew uses the word fulfill multiple times throughout his gospel, and is almost always used to tell how Jesus fulfilled one or more of the Old Testament verses, prophecies from the Old Testament that Jesus would later fulfill. For an example, we see Matthew chapter 8, verse 17, that says, "This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases to show that Jesus is the Messiah promised in the Old Testament." That's the purpose of the fulfillment language. Matthew is trying to prove to his audience that Jesus is the Messiah, and so he uses many of these fulfillments. You go back through look through the book of Matthew, and you will find this fulfillment formula. Other key themes are Jesus and the Old Testament. Jesus and the Old Testament. How does Jesus relate? It's not just fulfillment, but such as Jesus is the Messiah, a promised Messiah. Jesus is the son of David, and so all the prophecies given to David and his descendants apply to Jesus as well. Jesus is Emmanuel, which is God with us, which was an important theme of the Old Testament, God being with the people of Israel. Jesus as the Son of God. The new Moses, the Son of Man, a phrase used often in Daniel and Ezekiel, now being applied to Jesus. In fact, his favorite term for himself, as we see it there in Matthew. The wisdom of God, referring back to Proverbs 8 that we spoke earlier, and the personification of wisdom is a key theme in both Matthew and later on in John as well. As the King of Israel, as the eschatological ruler, as the chief cornerstone, using language that refers to the building of the temple of God, and in this case the church of God through Jesus. And then the bridegroom. All these are different themes that you'll find. As an example of one of those themes, if we were to embellish it a little bit and understand it deeper, let's look at the theme of the new Moses and how Jesus fulfills an Old Testament person, Moses, but in a slightly different way. We understand through Matthew's eyes who Jesus is in comparison to Moses. One prominent Old Testament character, Moses, with which Matthew compares Jesus, is the person of Moses. In the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, Moses was the man who God used to lead Israel out of slavery in Egypt and taking them to the promised land. By comparing Jesus to Moses, Matthew's saying he's a new liberator. He is going to take the people of Israel out of bondage again. But this time, it's not taking them out of slavery to the Egyptians, but slavery to sin and to the promised land, which is being back with God, dwelling with God. And it's a theology of being with God again and no longer living in captivity or in exile. So Jesus is the new Moses, if you will. Some of the ways that Matthew does this is not explicitly, but it's implicitly in the Scriptures. And so we have if you look on the PowerPoint before you now, you'll see there's a treatment of all the things that show up in Moses' life and the parallels you find them in Matthew about Jesus' life. For example, Moses was threatened with death by Pharaoh as a baby, along with all the other Hebrew male babies. Jesus was threatened by death by Herod as a baby, along with all the other Hebrews. So exact parallel there. You go down to the next one. Returns from exile after his enemies died. Jesus returned from exile in Egypt to Nazareth after Herod dies. Moses led Israel through the wilderness in temptation, but he sinned and Israel sinned. Jesus, on the other hand, stands in Israel's place and successfully withstands the temptation and the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness, as opposed to what Moses did. So he's now different than Moses. Compared, but different. He gave the law from Mount Sinai. Moses gave the law from Mount Sinai. Jesus gives a proper interpretation of the law and how to live it out, and even expands on the law on top of the mountain in Matthew 5 and 7, and through his healing ministries in Matthew 8 and 9. Moses had the glory of God shining on his face after he went up to Mount Sinai to receive the law. But Jesus shines his own glory after speaking with God on the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and with Elijah. Moses led Israel to inaugurate the Exodus through the Passover meal. Jesus has his own meal. He takes the Passover and redefines it, and what we refer to as the Last Supper, some refer to as the communion, some refer to as the Eucharist. It's Jesus redefining that meal. Moses brought plagues of God's judgment on Egypt, the ninth of which was darkness, the 10th was the death of the firstborn. Jesus' own death is a reinterpretation of those plagues, in a sense, and both at his death there was darkness, and of course the death of the firstborn, himself. And so redefines that particular those plagues. Moses issues his final words to a people from a mountain before they enter the promised land. Jesus issues his final commission to disciples from a mountain before they take the gospel to the nations. So you see lots of parallels there between the life of Jesus and Moses. It's not accidental. One, they happen. Two, Matthew recognized what's happening, and he's showing that Jesus is this new Moses. The outline of Matthew really falls into two major parts. But Matthew 1 through 13 includes a narrative section. With the infancy narrative of Jesus, it has a book of genealogies. Only other times that the phrase is used in the Greek is in the Greek Old Testament, in Genesis 2:4 and Genesis 5:1. So this idea of the book of Genesis is a rewriting, in a sense, of the Old Testament, but now something in the New that Matthew is doing. Matthew compares Jesus' birth with the original creation. In other words, Jesus is restoring creation. It's the beginning of that process of restoration, the redemption of mankind. Matthew 1:1 says that Jesus Christ is the son of David, the son of Abraham. This tells us, one, that Jesus is the Messiah, or he's the Christ. Two, he's the fulfillment of the main covenants of the Old Testament. Abraham's covenant that we talked about in Genesis 12, and then again reinforced in Genesis 15. And then David's covenant that someone would sit on the throne in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So he's reinforcing these covenants. The next section is the story of John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. And you can look through there. John the Baptist predicted by the Old Testament to proclaim he was predicted by the Old Testament to proclaim the coming Messiah. But here's the twist. John was baptizing sinners, and Jesus wanted to be baptized. Why? Because it would identify him as the King of the Jews, as God's Son. Go back and look at Psalm 2:7. And identify him as the suffering servant who would die for the sins of the world. So he's taking on the sins of the people. So even though he doesn't have to be sins for which he's being baptized, he's going to take on the sins of mankind. The third part of the first narrative section is that Jesus' temptation and beginnings of his ministry. Each temptation is a quotation. In each temptation, he quotes the book of Deuteronomy. So he's going back and reinforcing the Old Testament scriptures. But he's also showing where he succeeded, where Israel failed. You see, they were tempted and they failed in the wilderness. Jesus in the wilderness was tempted, but he was able to overcome temptation by staying true to, in a sense, the law, the word, because as he's quoting it. Then after this, we have the first teaching section, which is found in the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. And Jesus gives a reinterpretation of the law, a proper one that shows the law is supposed to be something of the heart, not just of your actions. Your heart has to be right. Followed by the second narrative section, in which Jesus performs miracles. He reinterprets the law. Both of these are important. The miracles show us Jesus' power over nature. And the miracles also provide Jesus the opportunity to confront the Pharisees about their misunderstanding of the law. That the law was made for man, not man for the law. Then there's another second teaching section. So you see there's this going back and forth of the narrative sections, teaching section, narrative section, teaching section, in which Jesus gives his disciples warnings and comfort about the future. The third narrative section is a challenge by John the Baptist in his Galilean ministry. And then there's healings are criticized. So John's being challenged, Jesus is being challenged now. People are no longer satisfied that these are reformers. They're afraid of where the reforms are going. So in the third teaching section, Jesus promises the people that the kingdom of God is at hand. and then begins to explain what that is going to look like. These parables help them. It's a series of parables explaining to the people what the kingdom of God is going to look like, who is in it, and how it's different than what the people expected. The last half of the book of Matthew, the outline, continues with another narrative section in which Jesus is rejected. John the Baptist dies. Some miracles take place. Peter confesses that Jesus truly is the Messiah. And then there's the Mount of Transfiguration experience. The final teaching section takes place there the fourth teaching section takes place. Jesus is teaching the disciples how they're to live with each other. Another narrative section then is Jesus' Judean ministry, entrance into Jerusalem, and then his final teaching section is Jesus teaching against the Pharisees, weeping for Jerusalem, and then teaches the Olivet Discourse, in which he's telling the disciples the end is coming, both in terms of his own physical demise, but the future. He's giving an eschatological peek of what's going to happen in the future. And then finally, chapters 26, 27, and 28 are the passion and resurrection narratives of the book of Matthew, in which he finally, at the end, tells his disciples to go forward into the whole world. He preaches and says the responsibility is to tell his story. This is the story of the book of Matthew. Thank you.